Welcome to Microcollege. This week on the podcast, we are really excited to have as our guest Dr. Ilana Redstone. Dr. Ilana Redstone is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's the founder of the Diverse Perspectives Consulting Firm and the president of the Mills Center for the Advancement of Critical Thinking, which is now part of the University of Austin in Texas. She's the co-author of Unassailable Ideas, How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education, and the creator of the Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes video series, which you can check out on YouTube. She's also a faculty fellow at the Heterodox Academy and a visiting fellow at the Mercatus Program for Pluralism and Civil Exchange. Thank you for joining us today, Ilana.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I've been listening to you. I definitely need to update my bio.
Well, is there something you'd like to add to that's changed?
No, I mean, the Mill Institute so my title there is faculty director. Okay. And it's the Mill Institute at UATX now. Okay. But the rest of it's mostly right. It's just funny that it needs to be updated, but it's perfectly fine.
Great.
Thank you.
In any case,
yes.
You've done a lot of interesting things, so we're excited to talk to you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
If you've listened to the podcast, you'll know that we'd like to ask about people's biographies. Mm-hmm. So if we could start off, if you could reflect back on the time when you were a college student, 18, 19, 20 years old, where were you? What were the big influences on you at that time? And what stood out as shaping you as an adult?
Interesting. Okay. So I did my undergraduate at the university. So I'm originally from the East Coast. I'm from Western Massachusetts, and I did my bachelor's degree at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire. And I don't think I knew what I wanted to do in college. I'm probably not unique in that regard. I don't think I was a standout student, certainly not early on. And I spent my junior year in college in southern Spain, which was great, which was in a lot of ways. And so I ended up majoring in Spanish, but mostly because I was good at languages and I liked Spanish, but mostly I had a lot of credits in it. And so, but I don't think I sort of envisioned myself as a Spanish teacher or something like that. So that was college, I would say. And then I spent a lot of time after college traveling. I was very fortunate in the sense, this was in the 90s. College was also a lot cheaper, mm-hmm. But I was really fortunate in the sense that I didn't come out with loans. And so thanks to the support of my father and so I didn't have loans, which let me travel. And so I was able to, for example, I taught English while living in Mexico, in Orizaba. I taught English in South, this is also back when you could do these things before everyone was just doing it online. I taught English in South Korea. And ultimately I joined, I think bringing the most relevant piece is ultimately I joined the Peace Corps in the late 90s. And so I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Togo in West Africa, so in between Ghana and Benin. And I think that one of the things, I think lots of people have sort of transformative experiences in the Peace Corps for all kinds of different reasons. I think for me, one of the things that I took away from it was that the problems that we care most about are really complicated. Even something like the Peace Corps, which raises questions about, are we propping up a corrupt government? Are we fostering complacency? Are we creating dependency? All of these questions that I don't think are unique to me. And to be clear, I don't think I arrived at answers to these. It wasn't like I came to some conclusion, we should all hightail it out of here. It was just sort of the aha moment was more just realizing that oh crap, this is actually kind of complicated.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, something that's carried through to the work that I do now. So that's the background. So I'll stop there. But yeah, that's kind of the background potted history.
Well, that's great. Certainly what stands out there is the travel and your Peace Corps experience. And mm-hmm. I think just I'd love to follow where you were going there with that, that international, cross-cultural experience. How does that inform, your work with diversity of perspectives and discourse and all of the things you're working on now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, the sort of bigger lesson was the one that I mentioned, which I'll come back to in a second. I think the smaller, I mean, maybe that's the wrong word, but sort of the first lesson was just that the world is really just full of people, at least in what I saw. The world seems to be just full of people trying to kind of do the best they can and make their way through life as best they can. And then the other piece of that was, again, this piece about the things that we care about being complicated. And that's really something. So in the work that I do now, which is really sort of focused on, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which is really focused on kind of how we think and communicate on really contentious issues. And part of that comes from this sort of baseline assumption that things are just complicated. And I frame that in the work that I do now. It's sort of framed in the language of the certainty trap, and which is just what it sounds like. That certainty is a trap, and the sort of the impacts of that in terms of how it shapes in a not a good way how we think and then subsequently how we communicate with other people about really heated issues. And by that I mean, issues that touch topics like identity, fairness, intent, harm, freedom, inequality, all of the sort of most contentious topics that people think about.
Yeah, you've written that you think you've observed that higher education produces too much uniform and simplistic thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think I stand by that. I think, yeah, I mean, I do think that it's too much. And the thing is that the problem with certainty, and so it's one thing to sort of point out and say, look, like we've oversimplified things, and most people, or not, maybe most is the wrong word, but many people will agree with that. But it's a lot easier once you're at the point where you've identified the thing that you've sort of put words to the thing that you're feeling certain about, that's kind of driving your judgment, and that's sort of sitting. And I can give you an example in a minute. Like, you're already sort of halfway there, maybe not all the way there, but you're sort of halfway there. And so it's much harder to get at the things the questions that we behave as though we have answers to that when we never bothered asking the question. And so that's the piece that's actually, I think, harder for people. And so, so I think there's a couple of ways to sort of correct for that. One is just recognizing that when we demonize and judge people who disagree about contentious on sort of these heated topics, it's always coming from some principle, value, or belief that you're holding as certain. And so, because certainty is the thing that basically gives you the justification to judge someone. I mean, there's sort of a tautology there, and that there's value in naming it. And then in naming it, sort of the sort of follow on to that is that there aren't any ideas, beliefs, values, etc., that are exempt from. And this is probably I imagine very consistent with Thoreau College, like that are exempt from criticism, questioning, examination. None. So like what this looks like in, when I work with students, for example, one situation that comes up. So in sociology, higher education in general is largely is very skewed in terms of obviously in terms of its political orientation, and then sociology in particular tends to be quite. There's not a lot of political diversity. I'm not saying anything new here. And so one of the things that we talk about, partly again because it's a sociology class, is inequality. And we spend a lot of time talking about inequality. And one of the things that I've done with students, this is just to demonstrate sort of how this idea of sort of walking people to this, recognizing the importance of uncertainty and sort of the work that it's doing in the background. So on inequality, like if I ask a room full of students and I say, you've all had some educational success. You're all sitting here. Like, I mean, you all know people from your high schools who didn't get into the U of I or who didn't who didn't go to college at all. Yes, of course, there are some who probably went to elite colleges and whatever, but you all know people who didn't, who didn't have the academic success that you're enjoying. And so, to what do you attribute your success? To what do you attribute the fact that you're sitting here in this classroom? And so they'll give answers like, I worked really hard, or I studied a lot, or I went to class, or I had a really inspirational teacher, or, my parents would have killed me if I, didn't get good grades, or I had a well-funded school, or, whatever. And because it's a sociology class, a lot of what, if they don't bring it up, one of the things I'll bring up is I'll say, and what about, people will talk about structural causes, structural discrimination, structural racism, things like this. And setting aside for the moment, like, can we define, like, what does that mean? What do the words mean? So just set that aside for a second. And they'll say, yep, that too, this makes sense. And then you can ask the question, well, can you rank order these things in terms of how they contributed to, again, we're just starting with the observation that you've had some success because you're sitting in this classroom. So and we've talked about all these factors that are contributing, can you put them in some kind of order? And so the aha moment for them is really, hopefully, is that they can't do it. And it's not because they haven't learned how to do it yet, but it's because it can't be done in any meaningful way. Mm-hmm. And so that recognition that you don't know, and sort of and you can't know, and sort of what does that mean for how we talk about or how we think about something that lots of people care about, and rightly so, like educational inequality. And so things like that, that's sort of the area that I'm interested in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. This is the classic Socratic insight about wisdom, right? Not knowing is much harder than thinking mm-hmm. right? That's been a powerful insight. I'm wondering, you've been an educator, you've been a professor, teacher for a long time now, and I'm wondering if you've seen changes in students, changes in the way higher education the way it works along these lines in the course of your career.
It's an interesting question. I know, like, a lot of people will people look back, we're in 2022, and they'll look back and they'll point to the 2016 presidential election. And sometimes also the other sort of turning point that people will point to is around 2013, 2014, in terms of changes in, people have done these studies about, language that's used in the media, and sort of, if you search for something like, white privilege or structural racism or something, sort of just the frequency with which those terms have used, there's a real shift starting around 2013, 2014. So I am sort of sensitive to that. I think for me, part of what I noticed, I don't know that there was any sort of singular moment. I think that it was just over time, partly coming from this place, sort of my priors one of my priors is that just nothing is simple. Like, social problems just aren't simple. They don't have simple causes. They don't have simple, and so part of what I noticed was just conversations, whether it was in my own department, whether it was with students, and in the kind of the broader discourse, and I would say even before 2013, where it just seemed like there were assumptions being made. Like, so I'll just give you an example. Like, if we're talking about a student who leaves, a graduate student who leaves, right? And I'll say this is a hypothetical. Like, if we're talking about a graduate student who leaves, and let's say you have a Black student who leaves the program. And so the assumption in that kind of conversation is that the student left because there weren't enough Black faculty to mentor the student. Mm-hmm. So that seems like a perfectly plausible explanation to me. I don't know that that's right, though. Like, I don't think other people, in the scenario I'm painting have more access to, let's say we all have the same information. The assumption is that, again, that's the cause, and then, which has a very specific solution that you need to, right? Like, it has a very specific hiring prescription. And so when I say, like, we are assuming that we have answers to questions. It's sort of like, well, wait, do we even know that that's what's going on? So that kind of thing, sort of in various situations. You know, I can remember teaching. My original focus in academia was on U.S. immigration.
Mm-hmm.
And so for a while, I taught a course on U.S. immigration. And I do remember at some point, and this would also have been before 2012 and 2013, like immigration used to be something that people had sides, and there was, you know, the sort of conservative view and the liberal view and whatever, but like it did largely cross party lines. Mm-hmm. Like if you go back, you know, 15 years or something, positions on immigration they weren't quite so. For example, you would have, you know, a sort of quote conservative argument that was in favor of higher levels of immigration because, you know, just wanting less interference in the markets. Right, or something, right? Or you would have a sort of liberal perspective on restrictions to immigration that was driven by a desire to sort of protect, the domestic workforce, and so there was more. It wasn't so cut and dried, and so that, like, things like that, I think, have changed, where it's like you're either on this side or you're on this side.
Does it seem that, I mean, that like kind of reduction of political perspective into party, right, where everyone has to line up on all the same issues, it's like another version of simplification, right? The ambiguity of having a person who is, I remember growing up here in Western Wisconsin, when we had a congressional election where there was a pro-choice Republican and a pro-life Democrat. And it's hard to imagine that happening right now, right? People are confused. What does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, which gets into all these really interesting questions about identity, right? Like, and group identity, and how we define who we are, and how we think about who we are, and what are the most salient characteristics that sort of make you a person. I mean, you can think about it in terms of political orientation, but it's the same. I mean, the same questions come up with respect to, you know, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. Like, how do we think about who we are, and how should we think about who we are, and what are the sort of costs and benefits to leaning a little bit more this way or leaning a little more this way, or and I think we just really don't do a good job of having those kinds of conversations. And I'm certainly aware that, like, it's not everyone's cup of tea to sit around and do this, you know, level of navel gazing. But I mean, certainly on college campuses and even in high schools, like, I mean, we could be doing a lot better than we are, even with the understanding that not everyone wants to sort of, you know, scratch their chin quite as much as maybe I do. Yeah.
This question about complexity and simplification is important to our project here. You know, putting sort of hot button like political and social issues on one side, I think that definitely is part of it. But the type of programs that we are doing here involve all kinds of uncertainty and ambiguity. When you're dealing with nature, right, with the weather, with animals, with plants, and also another important part of what we are doing here is participatory governance. So practical decision making, you know, dealing with you deal with sometimes the subconscious responses to things, even practical things like quiet hours and you know, meal planning and things like that. I certainly have observed in my career working in those kinds of environments, like this one, that my sense is that young people are more uncomfortable with that level of uncertainty. And it showed up actually. Compared to 20 years ago when I was starting, I have more young people asking me as teacher, as an administrator, to make more black and white rules about things, which is totally flipped from the other side, right? That the uncertainty produced by a situation where I say, this assignment is open-ended, right, for example, is something that my sense is that people are less comfortable with.
Really? So do you see that? So I'm just curious. So do you see that primarily manifest in student response to open-ended assignments, or how does that play out in terms of participatory governance, for example?
Well, I think it's harder for groups of students to be presented with an open-ended puzzle, right? How to do this thing? How do we stage this event, let's say, or how do we organize this project, right? There's a lot of uncertainty there. The group needs to sort themselves out into different roles. They need to make some key kind of decisions. My sense is that they need a lot more guidance, and they tend to default to looking for an authority figure, even on a small level on a project like that. And so,
but you're saying, but it's not just. It sounds like what you're saying. It's not just that they're looking for an authority figure, but they're doing it more than they did 15 years ago.
That is my sense. Yes.
Yeah.
That's a big question to me, why that is. I'm wondering if it has to do with, there are higher levels of uncertainty in general in the world, right? Things, certainly in the last few years with the pandemic, everyone's schedules and lives being upended, and the other kind of social upheavals you've mentioned, people are, there's a sense of looking for security in any form of structure that they can find. And that may be also in an ideological structure, right? If I can know where I sit, then I know something about the world.
You know, it's interesting. I went to a conference, a small conference last week or the week before, and it was one of the things that came up. So we were talking about some of this certainty stuff, and one of the things that someone suggested was the possibility that the desire, the sort of heightened if to the extent that this analysis is right, or that our analysis collectively here is right, that it's increased in the last, say, 15 years, that it's a response to the sort of fire hose of information that people are on the receiving end. I'm not even talking about mis or disinformation, that's a second, but just without even separating the wheat from the chaff, like just the fire hose of information that you are constantly receiving from the internet and everything online, and that this sort of the reaction, again, I don't know what I think about this, but the idea is that the reaction to that, or part of the reaction to that, is to simplify, like, oh my God, I'm standing in front of this fire hose, like I need to simplify this even more. I don't know how you would test that. I'm not sure how that's I mean, you could see that. I'm sure you can see the correlation over time, like, you know, complexity, and like you could probably measure that, but even that wouldn't, you know, obviously demonstrate some kind of causal link. But it is an interesting theory.
Yeah, I just, a manifestation of this, I was 8 or 10 years into my high school teaching career before I heard the word rubric. Right, and now I have students asking for rubrics, right? And which is a structured way of responding to things, which I think there's a lot of strength to that, right? And clear expectations, all of that. But it's interesting. It was not something that I heard, students asking for, but in the past. And I think that what you're saying, the fire hose of information, we kind of need some way to sort that. So we're looking for some cheat sheet, basically, where to put things.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's an interesting example. I don't think I ever made like a grading rubric before, like in the last, few years. Yeah. I never thought about it that way, but yeah. I mean, it's an interesting idea. So I don't know. Again, I don't know if there's a causal arrow to be pointed to there, but maybe.
Nice project. So maybe we could take a step back here. So if we've got this, what you're observing is, a problem with an uncomfortableness with complexity and oversimplification, and a certainty trap. Can you play that out? Just lay this out. Why is that something we should be concerned about? What impacts does that have on education and us as a society, if that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could actually so there's a couple of ways sort of into this conversation. One of them is just, there's certainly polling. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but there's certainly polling data that looks at, tries to capture these measures of political polarization, which is sort of, we need to be more precise about what that means. But questions that will ask people about, do you think that members of the other political party are immoral, sort of? I don't think they actually ask, do you think they're horrible people? But like, they'll certainly, I know there's at least one poll that asks specifically about, like, are they immoral? Are they dishonest? Are, I think, unintelligent? So things like that, and all of those percentages have gone up and are high. I mean, if I'm remembering, they're sort of in 60-70% on both sides, like going in both directions. And so you can look at that kind of polling data. So again, like if we're starting with that and we're saying this judgment comes from certainty, right? Like that is where it comes from. And so in terms of the impacts on society, what are the impacts of political polarization? Well, I mean, there's arguably one of them being sort of, I think there's an argument to be made that it pushes people further to extremes, right? The more polarization you have, the more siloed people are. This is sort of the group, then you get into this group polarization. This is Cass Sunstein's work about, that groups, when they're more siloed, tend to come out with even more extreme views than when they're sort of exposed to a diversity of perspectives. I think there's a whole separate piece of this that has to do with public trust. There's sort of social trust, right, which gets to some of the political polarization. Social trust also, I think, with the absence of social trust weakens communities, right? When you have which many communities are politically diverse to a greater or lesser extent. And so you have a decline in social trust. And then there's also sort of public trust, right, which certainty also erodes, in the sense that when you have institutions that use language of certainty rather than confidence, that also leads to an erosion of public trust. So specifically, institutions might be things like the media, higher education, school, K through 12 education, all of these things. And this is real, again, like just a function of using the language of certainty rather than confidence. And if you look at an example, think about, for instance, COVID. And so how we talk about, and by we in this case, I'm talking about an institution, but how our institutions talk about, yes, wear masks, they work, they will protect you from COVID. Vaccines will prevent COVID. No, they won't prevent COVID. They will, reduce the likelihood of getting a severe case. It's, there are no harmful side effects. There could be some harmful side effects, but they're really improbable and they're really unlikely, but we can't actually say that they don't exist. Like all of this stuff, it all matters. And it's all, but you make one claim, I mean, let alone 500 of them, or what, I didn't count, but you make one claim and then it's sort of like, well, wait, that's not actually right. And how do you get to that's not right? Well, either sometimes, we get new information later on that sort of changes things. And sometimes people just, if someone makes a claim that you sort of, and they claim something to be certain, and you have sort of an intuition that wait, that's not, if I say, there was this research study that this was an actual research study. Then one of the claims was that taking more baths reduces stress. Right? This is a silly example. It's not a controversial issue or anything. But if I say, yeah, go take a bath, it'll reduce your stress. Well, wait, what? There's some, you may not think of that in the language of certainty, but you might be like, well, wait, how do you know that that's, how do you know? And so that now I'm just talking about sort of a causality piece, but well, wait, okay, well, there's a study that says that, having more baths reduces stress, but maybe just the people who were less stressed to begin with actually were more likely to take baths, and it has nothing to do with the bath, or whatever. So being more sort of careful, it's not just as simple as being careful. Part of it is about being careful about the language that we use, but the language, this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, the language that we use most of the time is a reflection of how we're thinking, and sort of clear thinking leads to clear writing and also clear speaking. And sort of, we're not in the habit of being particularly clear or precise about, and so and we can do better. It's not even actually that hard. But the hard part is in realizing that it's the stuff that what's the expression? It's the unknown unknowns. It's the things that you don't even know that it's it's there. If you have that sort of visceral tendency to judge, or you think something's really simple, it's sort of that you have to sort of recognize that that's coming from certainty. And then it's that it's there and you have to find it. One of the things that I would say, just as a point of clarification, one of the questions that comes up sometimes is someone will say, well, are you just saying that, any argument's as good as any other? Should we be teaching, intelligent design in our schools instead of evolution? And so I guess I would make 2 points just to anticipate those questions. One is that there's nothing in what I'm saying that says that every explanation has an equal probability of being true, right? Like there's just, this is in some ways at a basic level, there's probabilistic thinking here. So there's nothing that suggests that that's true. The other thing I would say about sort of every opinion being as valid as any other, when I say that part of where we need to get to is this recognition that there are no ideas, beliefs, values, et cetera, that are exempt from criticism, questioning, or examination. One way to think about that is if I bake you, a batch of cookies, right? Like, and I say, so I could bake a batch of cookies. You and I could have a conversation about what's in those cookies. We could have a very sort of boring, I could tell you there's butter and there's flour and there's sugar and there's salt and like chocolate chips and whatever. And that doesn't mean, the fact that you and I are not talking about whether the cookies are delicious or whether they taste like crap or whatever, doesn't mean that someone else can't come in and evaluate the cookies and say whether they taste like crap or whether they taste good. Now, I would want to know, like, well, what do you mean they taste good? Like, you like things that are sweet, or you like this amount of chocolate chips or that, whatever. Like, those would still be subject to questioning and examination in terms of understanding, but those are just fundamentally different.
Yeah.
So in other words, the fact that I'm saying actually nothing is exempt from questioning, criticism, it's almost like we're talking about the ingredients of the cookies, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for someone to come in and say, these cookies taste like garbage. Like,
yes.
If that makes sense.
Sure. There's different categories of knowledge, right? There's quantitative knowledge, there's sort of quantitative knowledge, there's factual things like that.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying raises some important, these are theory of knowledge, epistemological kind of questions. To me, it seems that if you do have a notion of there is an objective truth somewhere to be determined, that actually makes this viewpoint diversity and this quality of discourse especially important, right? Because that's actually how you find you get to closer to some sense of that understanding of reality. Whereas if it is undeterminate, we can't actually come to any agreement. There's a purely relativistic situation, then it just has to do with power, right? It has to do with who's able to exclude other voices and enforce their perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to think about it is, one way that I've sort of tried to think about it is with the following metaphor, that when we think about the world and how we're sort of viewing social interactions and different events, almost as though we're looking out a window and we're sort of seeing these things unfold. And one of the things that happens when we're looking out a window, like if you were sitting here at this table with me and I said, and we both had our glasses on and whatever, and I said, oh, look at the bird sitting on the fence or something, like presumably you would see the bird sitting on the fence in the same, the little black bird or blue bird or whatever it is. And you would see what I'm seeing. And I think a more precise way to think about it is that we're seeing the world reflected in a mirror, not because we're seeing ourselves. That's one thing that mirrors do if you're standing in front of them. But because one of the other things we know about mirrors is that the only kind of mirror that precisely reflects in proportion and distance what's in front of it is a perfectly flat plane of glass. Right? And any curvature to the glass, whether it's concave, convex, severe, mild, whatever, distorts the image that's being reflected. This is why you have fat mirrors and skinny mirrors and everything else. And so the idea is that all certainty curves the glass, right? And so realizing that, and sometimes we choose to live with that, right? Like there may be cases where, if I say, like, let's say I happen to be in a situation where I observe someone stealing a car, like, or I assume they're taking a car without permission that doesn't belong to them. And I think, well, that's a horrible thing to do. Like then I'm judging that even that judgment, where does that, and this is a simple example, where does that judgment comes for? It comes from my core belief or whatever that stealing is wrong. Right. And that's fine. Like, I don't have to let go of that in order to say, okay, well, what would it be like if I didn't think that stealing was wrong? Like, what would that be like? Like, is that something can I imagine a world where stealing isn't right? I mean, I don't have to let it go in order to be able to ask that question, if that makes sense.
Right. You need to be aware that you're looking at a mirror and you're choosing it. That's
and that's my belief. That's my principle, that stealing is wrong, is essentially curving the glass, but that's fine. Like, I can name it and I can point to it and I can say, I'm going to hold on to that thing.
Yep.
But we can still examine it and question it and sort of kick the tires, metaphorically.
Yep. Yeah, that really resonates with me. Certainly, as an educator, I think of a lot of times what I'm doing is helping people be aware of their paradigms, right? Their the lenses that they're using, and ultimately, I think I feel most successful when students are able to start to choose. This is this is the lens that I'm using, and there's a good reason for me to use it, right? And then if necessary to change that, right? And that's I think like we mentioned COVID, and I think biology is especially prone to this, right? There's a very quantitative, measurement-based way of approaching that's important for understanding the way human bodies and biology works, or agriculture is the same thing. But if you divorce that from social factors or from qualitative value, aesthetic kind of factors, right, and you're only using one lens out of those, then you're probably you're not at least freely choosing. You're not really using this full set of tools in the toolbox, at least.
Yeah, I mean, and frankly, I don't have I have way more questions than I have answers.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about the sort of biology, I mean, one of the ways people will off that particular issue that you're talking about plays out is when people think about the relationship between biology and gender, right? And sort of one of the things that one of the questions, I don't have really much of an interest in taking a particular stand one way or the other, but I do find the questions interesting in the sense that if we can say, right, I mean, if we can say that, say gender is divorced from biology, right? This gets into the certainty piece. If we could say gender is entirely a social construct, that there's enormous power in that. I don't mean power in the sense of people grabbing for power, but I mean in terms of social change, right? There's enormous power in that, because if something is socially constructed, then we can socially deconstruct it. And we can, and the way that when you're there is when when in theory, when there are 50% of nurses who are men and there are 50% of construction workers who are women. And that's how we know when we're there, if we think that gender is entirely a social construct. That's one world. There's a world where I don't know a lot of people who are making the argument that gender is entirely biological. My sort of read on the situation is there's sort of gender is a social construct, and then there's, or maybe more of a social construct, and then there's gender is more or partly or whatever. But I don't know that it's almost like the abortion thing. I don't know that anyone's actually, or not anyone, but few people are sitting literally on the extremes. But those get into, how you think about that. So let's say, to the gender and biology question, if you think that it's partly a social construct, partly biological, it raises a lot more complex questions about, do you think that, well, how do we know when we're there, when we've sort of really eliminated gender norms and pressure for specific gender roles and whatever? We can no longer expect 50-50 up and down the occupational hierarchy, because if we're acknowledging that part of it is traced to biological differences, and it gets much more complicated. Again, I'm not there are people trying to sort of haggle out the answer to that question. What I'm more interested in is how do we talk about it, and the fact that if we make any of those claims with certainty, that's where it leads to judgment. And the reality is that we don't. Now, that may be a question. Maybe we do know one day. Maybe there's one day where we do we can map that all out, and it's all known, in the sense that there was a point when we didn't know that, water turns to ice at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It still turned to ice at 32 degrees Fahrenheit even before we knew that it did, right? And so maybe there's some day where our knowledge about gender and biology, but maybe there isn't. I don't know. We're not there now. But it's the claims of certainty and viewing our knowledge as certain rather than provisional that leads to the judgment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've not only you've done a lot of thinking about this. You've written books, you've written articles, you've given talks, but you've also created curriculum, right? And I take it to be quite popular and curriculum that people are interested in, and people can get a taste of that in this Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes series on YouTube. But maybe can you talk about this? How do you bring these ideas into the classroom, working with college students and other people?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of thoughts. So right now I'm teaching in the fall. I usually teach a course in social problems, which is the one that I'm teaching now. So our semester ends next week. And usually in the spring, for the past couple of years, I've taught a course called Bigots and Snowflakes, sort of about political polarization. And I won't be teaching that in the spring of 2023 because I'm off from teaching. I have a teaching release, but normally that's sort of what I'm doing. And I think the way that I do that, I mean, we bring in different readings. So for example, in the social problems class, they read the first book, the book that we started out with was Hans Rosling's Factfulness. And so that was kind of our starting point. And then they read different pieces of, I mean, we read a little bit of, actually we listened to a talk by Thomas Sowell that was a starting point for a conversation. They read some of Eduardo Bonilla Silva's book, Racism Without Racists, and then different articles and things over the course of the semester. And really, but it's about sort of the discussion and sort of, and how we talk about all of these problems. Because again, like that's way more important to me than, can you tell me what, the unemployment rate for women, unmarried women between the ages of 34 and 39. Like okay, yes, that's important, but it's not, I'm much more interested in sort of working with them on how they're thinking about topics. So, right now, I'll come full circle on this question, but right now, like to the students in the social problems class are submitting paper topics for the end of the semester. And so they all submit their topics and I'll basically respond to their topic suggestions with questions. Like, what is the tension that you don't just get to pick the social problem that you want to sort of inform the world about. Like, what is the tension that you're looking at? Like, what is it? What are the questions that it brings up? And I'll usually make some suggestions and sort of, so that's kind of the way that I'm trying to work, and through a lot of discussion. And then the other thing that I would say is that I'm also, with the amazing support of the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning at the U of I, I've been in the middle of creating a MOOC for Coursera on the certainty trap stuff, cool. Which should be, hopefully done late spring 2023. So that would be another way into this for interested parties.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm especially curious about how you begin these courses. In a way that here at Thoreau College and other microcolleges we've been talking about, we're building, a kind of intensive version of an intentional community where young people are coming together. We have had quite a bit of viewpoint diversity, you could say, in the students, but they're literally living together. They're working together with their hands. They're cooking meals together. They're going on camping trips, and they're talking about ideas and politics and their life. So this is a real live practical question. How do you create an environment where these kinds of conversations can happen? What is the seedbed or the preparation for a community to engage in the way that you are advocating?
I think it's a lot of these students, we spend 15 weeks together 3 times a week. So I guess it's not the same as living together, but I mean, we do have time, which gives us time to sort of play with ideas, not only play with ideas, but also circle back to things a lot. And so a lot of it is sort of just talking through, recognizing and sort of repeating the practice of what's going on. Sometimes we'll start the class by talking about, whatever's going on in the world, whatever the latest thing is, in terms of controversy or whatever, and sort of talking about that. Like I let them bring up a lot of topics and stuff that they're interested in, and sort of sometimes what I've done in the past is I'll say, bring me a topic that you think is, straightforward, like sort of cut and dried, like, in terms of a controversial issue, like bring me something that you think is cut and dried, and I will try and come up with some questions that make it at least a little less cut and dried. And I said, don't bring me something like, the Rwandan genocide or something. I don't want to do it. But and so that's one way. So I think it's really, to answer your question, I think it's the repetition. And obviously I think, students work and sort of learn at different paces. And so I think they're not always at the same place, but I think it's the repetition, of doing that and sort of thinking about things over and over again. Like, I'm just thinking yesterday I had a guest speaker to the class, and he was talking about, he was someone is a former teacher in Chicago public schools. And he was talking about his experience with an allegation from a student, and his, the sort of end of the story, he was acquitted and whatever, got through this sort of whole legal system and everything. And she was saying, she being one of the students in the class, was saying, well, do you think that, I don't remember exactly how she phrased the question, but she said something like, well, how do you think that some of the fact that, the way things turned out for you was due to because he was a white man, was due to your white privilege? And so, which is fine, like that's fine to ask. And I said, and he sort of offered his thoughts on that. And then I was like, but how do you know, this is the sort of, again, it's sort of always coming back to the certainty, like, okay, you're calling it white privilege. How do you know, like, how do you know what percent, like how much of it is because he's white? Like, I'm not saying that the white privilege isn't real, I'm not saying, like, I don't even need to take a stand on it one way or the other, because I'm not even sure what I would say. Mm-hmm. But it's just the question of, like, okay, he had this experience in the legal system. You've got all these different moving parts. How do you know that it's because of, or what percent of it is because of the fact that he's white? And sort of what does it mean that that's sort of the default? And so the students were, and she, as soon as I said it, she was like, oh yeah. She was like, yeah, that's a good question. And I was like, yeah, I don't have the answer. I don't have to have the answer. You don't have to have the answer. Just think about it. Like, questioning your own defaults and just understanding that we have those defaults, even though I'm not coming in and saying, what do you mean? Like, it's his white privilege. Like, it's obviously not his white privilege. I'm not saying any of that. Like, I'm just saying, how do you know? So that kind of thing. That's a long answer to your question, but it's a lot of those kinds of conversations.
Yeah. So good facilitation, obviously, is
aspirationally, yes.
Yes. Do you have situations where students really get angry at each other, where there's intense, like, sharp kind of anger between people?
I've been doing this for a number of years. I have not had that experience. Like, I did have one, I will say I think I had one student a couple of years ago who wasn't very sort of careful, and it was a man. He wasn't sort of particularly careful in how he expressed his ideas. And he was, I don't know if he was politically conservative or not. Like, I don't know where he fell, and so I do know that there were some students who kind of would bristle at some of the things that he said. And so one of the things that I would try and do is say, like, reflect back to him and say, like, is this what you mean? Or is this what you're trying to get at? Is this the problem that you're trying to get at or identify? Like, and try and, I think which brings me to sort of a more general comment, which is that I think one of the things that's been useful is depersonalizing the conversation, and sort of saying, like, okay, well, like, giving students the space to say, this doesn't have to be, you can just, like, it's almost like you're putting on a hat, like, where this idea, like, what would somebody who thinks this say? Like, what might somebody say? Like, you don't have to, by doing this, and I will say literally, like, by doing this, you are not endorsing or condemning a particular opinion. You are just thinking it through. And so, and I'll do that. I'll say, and I'll use the same language. Like, I'll say, I'm just channeling an argument. Like, what would this be like? And so, but I think that distance, giving them rather than what do you think, or what is, like, giving them some distance to separate themselves, I think can be, can kind of free people up a little bit. So I haven't I mean, it's entirely possible that people are having their own sort of internal experiences that they're not sharing with me. So I can't speak to that. But I have not really had the experience where, thankfully, where things have gotten out of control. I mean, I'm trying to think, like, there have probably been times over the years, like, this is one of the benefits of having 15 weeks to sort of talk to people, where maybe you back off, maybe you just read the room and you're just like, yeah, let's come back to this next time. Like, but that's easy enough to do. Like, so they think there probably, I don't know that happens a lot, but I mean, it probably is not never.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was about social media and what role do you think social media plays in these dynamics? And I mean, it seems like a lot of the experience of polarization and the sense of intense division in our society often comes from people's online experiences rather than their in-person experiences in some
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, I mean, social media sort of incentivizes all of the oversimplification that I'm trying to avoid. Twitter in particular, I'm not on a lot of social media. I mean, I'm on Twitter, but like, I don't do a lot with it. But yeah, it absolutely sort of puts all of the wrong incentives in place. Like, the more outrage, simplification leads to you get outrage with simplification, and that's and outrage gets tweets and retweets and likes and all that other stuff and gets you followers and things like that. So the incentives are all wrong, and then you have the problem of the algorithms in terms of what you're presented with. In fact, the organization, what is it called? The Institute for Humane Technology or something. I think maybe it's called Tristan Harris's organization. So one of the things, my understanding that they do is sort of, he's working on this problem of those algorithms and the way that they sort of lead people into more, everyone, people talk about this. You start out looking at cat videos and you end up, watching something about, Nazis or whatever.
Right.
And like part of the way that I think about what I'm doing is he's working on a scale that I don't have, or at least not yet. But part of the way that I think about it is he's working on the supply side. I'm working on the demand side in terms of how people are taking in information and sort of synthesizing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're coming up to the top of our hour here. I'm wondering, if you could talk a bit about the Mill Institute and the University of Austin and the projects that you're working on right now, and how that fits into these issues.
Yeah, I mean, the Mill Institute. So the Mill Institute was originally the Mill Center. Well, actually, it was the Mill Center for the Advancement of Critical Thinking, which was what you started out saying, and then it was shortened to the Mill Center, and then partly because critical thinking is poorly defined.
Yeah.
And people think it is whatever they want to think it is. And now it's the Mill Institute at UATX. And so, which has been great. I mean, the University of Austin is, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with it or not. I mean, the University of Austin is a new university. They don't actually have that name yet. It's UATX is the name for now until they have an official recognition from the state of Texas. Which is in process. And so the UATX is, they are hoping to take their first students have their first cohort in the fall of 2024, and taking applications in the fall of 2023. And with the Mill Institute, and so there's a whole side to the administrative side to UATX that I'm not fully immersed in. The Mill Institute, what we're doing in particular is, a couple of things. One is sort of building and creating resources that can take sort of this approach that we're talking about, leveraging certainty, lowering the stakes in conversations on heated topics, and creating resources for educators in the classroom to do that. And hopefully, this is more of a funding issue, hopefully also multimedia resources in terms of videos and things like that. That's one thing. We're also working closely with the UATX on thinking sort of concretely and working with them to create the culture of conversation that they are wanting to create, and sort of how do you do that and what kinds of things can you put into place. Like, so for example, one of the things that I would love to see them do, we haven't presented this formally to them, but one of the things I would love to see them do would be every week have an email that goes out to the student, actually the whole campus community, and pick, whatever issue that week. Pick some, hot button issue that's in the news that week, and at the bottom, like, describe it in as sort of factual terms as you can, and the sort of parameters of the issue, and then have a section, like every week there are questions, 5 questions, 3 questions, whatever. What do these raise? What does this issue raise? Like, what are the core questions? Like, is it about identity? Is it about an intent? Is it about, what are the assumptions? Like, and in sort of fostering that, as building that as part of the community. So hopefully that will get adopted, but things like that. And then the third piece is programming. So we're doing some programming, some public-facing programming called Say More, which is public events where we're trying to get sort of people talking about major contentious issues, but it's not a debate. And really the goal is for the participants in the audience to leave with a sense of all of those things that we usually, maybe not all, but like the assumptions that we make tacitly, that are implicit, that don't get said out loud, and taking them and making them and saying, this is actually, and naming them and sort of examining them a little bit more closely. So that's kind of what's going on for the Mill Institute. It's been very exciting. Like, and there's a great team with the other 2 women at the Mill Institute. They are fantastic. And so, yeah, it's really good stuff.
Awesome. That's a really important work. I guess as a final question, and maybe just picking up from what you were talking about, I'm wondering if people listening to this who are resonating with what you're saying, who are recognizing some of these concerns in the world, but they are at different phases of life. Maybe they're young people in high school or in college. Maybe they're people in middle age or older people. Do you have any suggestions, any tips, any ideas for, in your day-to-day life? How can you challenge your senses of certainty and just
I love that question.
Increase your exposure to different perspectives?
I love that question. I guess I would say, I would sort of say 2 things, one of which you kind of already pointed to, which is perfect, which is that this isn't about, it's not some kind of toolkit that's for, gotcha on like the person who disagrees with you, or to win a debate. This is about sort of really interrogating our own thinking and interrogating other people's thinking, but also interrogating our own. Mm-hmm. And so like, there's a lot of, you've got to be willing to do that too. And I don't mean like do the work, like in the way that term is used, but like you have to be willing to say like, oh yeah, if nothing is off the table in terms of being questioned and examined, that means all of those things that I'm holding right like this, they get to be questioned and examined too. And in order to do that, you have to name them. And so that's one thing. And then I think I would say in the simplest terms, particularly when it comes to these kinds of heated issues, when you feel that kind of, and I think we all know what that feels like. Oh my God, this person must be an idiot. And, or like this person is a horrible person or a bigot or a snowflake or whatever, to use the terms from the videos. That's coming from certainty. Like it's coming from somewhere. And that is not, and I want to be super clear, like, I'm not saying that there aren't horrible people in the world. Like there's nothing, it's the assumption, it's the lack of interrogating it, it's the lack of questioning it, it's the lack of sort of examining, where does that come from? What am I basing that on? Or is there another possible explanation that could be true? So that if there's a sort of, the simple thing would be, when you have that feeling, that sense, find the uncertainty. It's there. Find the certainty. It's there somewhere. Name it. It's there. It's there. That's how you know it's there. If that makes any sense. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Self-knowledge, know thyself, right? That's old piece of advice there from the Oracle. So yeah, right. Dr. Redstone, thank you so much for your time and for your work. And it's been a real pleasure. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Jacob.